South Africa's land debate is reaching a boiling point, with new expropriation laws being passed and radical proposals suggesting up to 80% of private property must be redistributed. The stakes have never been higher. Many believe this is a long overdue correction of historical injustices. But what if these laws, intended to help the oppressed, end up creating a new oppressed class? What if, in the near future, Black South Africans find themselves on the receiving end of the very laws they once supported? History has shown us that power shifts, and when it does, the laws put in place today can be used to justify new injustices tomorrow. Are we fixing the past, or setting the stage for an even bigger disaster? The history of land in South Africa is one of dispossession and exclusion. The 1913 Natives Land Act made it illegal for Black South Africans to own land outside of designated areas, restricting them to just 7% of the country's landmass. Under apartheid, the situation worsened. Millions were forcibly removed from their homes under the Group Areas Act. By 1994, land ownership was overwhelmingly skewed in favor of the white minority. After the fall of apartheid, the ANC introduced a willing buyer, willing seller policy to redistribute land without force. But the process was slow, expensive, and riddled with corruption. Frustration grew, and soon, calls for more radical policies began to rise. In response to growing unrest, the South African government introduced the Expropriation Act of 2024. This law allows the state to seize private property for public interest, in some cases without paying compensation. The biggest problem with expropriation without compensation is that it undermines property rights. Once the government can take land without payment, investors lose confidence, businesses collapse, and economic decline follows. But an even more extreme proposal has surfaced. A bill suggesting that 80% of private property, farms, businesses, even homes, must be expropriated to reflect racial demographics. This would be one of the most radical land redistribution policies in modern history. Dr. Ndlovu. In theory, redistribution sounds like justice. But in reality, when governments take control of land on this scale, we see inefficiency, economic collapse, and new forms of inequality emerge. We don't have to guess what happens when land is expropriated without compensation. We've seen it before. In the early 2000s, Zimbabwe implemented a similar land redistribution program. The result? A collapsed agricultural sector, mass unemployment, hyperinflation, and millions of Zimbabweans fleeing to neighboring countries, including South Africa. At first, the policy was aimed at white farmers. But over time, even Black Zimbabweans who had acquired land through legal means saw their properties seized. The government, once given power to expropriate, did not stop with one group. Now let's fast forward. Imagine the ANC loses power. A new government, perhaps one dominated by an authoritarian leader or a different ethnic or political group, takes control. The Expropriation Act is still in place. The legal precedent has already been set. What stops this new government from using these same laws to seize property from Black South Africans? After all, if the argument today is that historical injustice justifies land seizure, what happens when a new group claims they were oppressed and demand redistribution from the current Black landowners? Advive. Sipho Mkhize. Once a government has the legal power to expropriate land without compensation, there is nothing preventing them from using it against any racial or political group in the future. That's why laws should never be written to favor one group over another. Because one day, power shifts. Already there are reports of Black business owners in urban areas fearing that they too will lose their properties under these laws. Once the government controls the land, who really owns anything? Land reform is necessary, but is large-scale expropriation the only way? What if there were better, more sustainable solutions, ones that don't destroy the economy or set dangerous legal precedents? Dr. Johan Meyer. Expropriation is a short-term political fix with long-term consequences. A more effective approach would be supporting Black farmers through subsidies, training, and access to capital. The problem is not just land, it's resources, knowledge, and infrastructure. One alternative is a land reform fund, where the government partners with private investors to help Black South Africans acquire and develop land productively, rather than simply redistributing it with no support. Countries like Kenya have shown that secure land tenure, rather than forced redistribution, leads to economic empowerment. By giving farmers ownership titles and business loans, they become self-sufficient instead of dependent on the state. Another alternative is urban land reform, where the focus shifts to affordable housing and business development in cities, rather than just rural farms. Most South Africans today live in urban areas, so land reform should reflect modern economic realities. Instead of taking land from one group and handing it to another, the government should invest in skills development, agricultural technology, and financial support for new landowners, ensuring they can actually use the land productively. At V. Thandi Maseko, any land reform policy must protect property rights for all citizens. Otherwise, we risk creating new victims in the future. A stable economy depends on clear and fair legal frameworks, not political revenge policies. South Africa does not need to repeat the mistakes of Zimbabwe. There are alternatives to mass expropriation, alternatives that create real opportunities without tearing the country apart. South Africa's land issue is real, but the solution is not to destroy property rights. The moment we allow expropriation without safeguards, we set a precedent that can be used against anyone in the future, black or white. This is not just about race, it's about power. And power is always temporary. Are we solving past injustices, or are we laying the foundation for new ones? Think carefully about the policies you support today, because tomorrow they could be used against you. Be careful what you wish for. What do you think? Should land be expropriated at this scale? Or is this a dangerous road for South Africa? Or should the government explore market-based reforms instead of expropriation? Or is radical redistribution the only way? Let's talk in the comments. Leave your thoughts in the comments below.